On this segment, we're going to talk about resistance and how it works in tandem with governance. We will talk to Jasmine Gomez and Roberta Mullen on that subject. We'll talk to Catherine and Ashley about their perspectives on resistance. Hi, my name is Margaret Smalley, and I'm here with Jasmine Gomez, a representative from the Circle of Blue. So we've talked about governance, but now we're going to talk more specifically about resistance, and we're going to ask Jasmine about that. So, Jasmine, what do you believe is the relationship between governance and resistance?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. You have to look at governance and resistance not as this dichotomy and these two forces that are constantly in conflict. You need to see them more as this interconnected relationship. You know, you can't have one without the other. So, you know, governance isn't merely resisted. They're not merely always fighting against each other. You have to look at, you know, governance is being resisted, but through this resistance, you're seeing reform. So that's the whole point. I mean, you really want to have governance and resistance. You really want to see this distinction between governance and resistance blurred, so we can actually, you know, see a humanizing of, you know, culture and of globalization and a redescription of values for the most part.
You've talked about this relationship. What are some specific characteristics of each that enable this redescription to occur?
Well, you really want to look at its contingent nature and its fallible nature. You know, different words and, you know, phrases like justice, liberty, equality, community, all of these words have different meanings and different translations in other cultures and other languages, and all their meanings are relative. So, I mean, just in and of itself, those are contested vocabularies. So as they are contested, so as these words, you know, their definitions are contested, you're seeing a redescription of values as there's, you know, you're drawing some consensus. You also have to look at the experimental nature. You know, through resistance, we're not looking for, you know, this monumental universal ethic that changes the world. You know, we're looking for small-scale approaches that can address issues, you know, like poverty, having everybody have a voice, institutional reform. And through these different approaches, through, you know, these examples of resistance contesting governance, you're really seeing this redescription of values.
So you've talked a little bit about a normative agenda. Would the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be an example of what you're explaining?
Definitely. I mean, on a large scale, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights definitely is a part of the normative agenda. But on the other hand, you know, it's important to keep in mind that we're not necessarily talking about universal values in resistance. You know, we're talking about, you know, a growth of a human rights culture. So, you know, as I said before, we're not talking about this transcultural truth. You know, values mean different things. People have different ideas about human rights. So while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is important, we also need to remember that there is no universal truth. So human rights constantly are being contested and resisted, which is what's really important.
Okay. So we've been talking about some theoretical examples associated with resistance. Could you give us any, you know, something that we could hold on to, something a little bit more real world?
Definitely. I mean, just in reference to globalization, which is obviously a global phenomenon, there's been a lot of instances and events that have contested, you know, this free market fundamentalism of the United States and the Washington Consensus, such as, you know, just the financial crises in Latin America and East Asia and Eastern Europe. And, I mean, even just a growing belief that globalization has been associated with vast income differences on an international scale, and, you know, on even a community level, on the community level and on the regional level. So just a recognition that people are realizing that, okay, you know, yes, globalization may have positive effects, but there are also consequences. So, I mean, just this realization and this, you know, growing culture of resistance and the relationship between governance and resistance is just really what's going to enable us to humanize globalization.
Well, thank you very much for all of this information.
Thank you.
Hi, Margaret Smalley with 60 Minutes here again. This time I'm here with Roberta Mullen, and we're going to have some more on resistance. So Roberta, what role does resistance play in governance?
Well, I don't see resistance and governance as two diametrically opposed ideas, but I do think that resistance's relationship to government can vary. On the one hand, I think resistance can be seen as like a legitimate opposition to the authority that's in place already without like greatly contesting or trying to overthrow it. But I think on the other hand, you could have a more radical form of resistance where you're completely rejecting the system of authority that's in place. So in my opinion, the real question then is who is the legitimate voice of resistance? And I think it's the person in the end who ultimately has the most power and authority to make those decisions.
Interesting. How do you see resistance working in the world today?
Well, I think the key thing to remember is that the local and the global levels have to work together in order for resistance to be very legitimate. And I think that it's not necessarily about seizing power, but about creating power too. And I think that movements must remember that, like a solidarity movement, for example. So you could have two diametrically opposed sides where there's not necessarily one side against another, but many players could be involved, and resistance could be taking place at many levels. So I think, in my opinion, that resistance without authority is just a blueprint for domination to keep continuing. And I think that you must transform authority through resistance in ways to make your movement or make your cause legitimate.
So in your view, what role do elites play in global governance?
Well, in my opinion, global governance is the site where the elite and the powerful are making the decisions, and they're the ones calling the shots. And you cannot discuss the world polity without bringing up those normative and ethical questions. And the same applies with resistance as well. I think you have to have the power and the authority to be making those calls and making those decisions at the higher levels. And you also have the power and the authority to resist them as well. I think a perfect example in the modern context is the role of celebrities as they stand behind the issues that they champion on the global scale. Are Angelina Jolie and Bono necessarily the most qualified people to be speaking on these issues? No. But they do have the power and the authority to be able to resist them on a widespread scale and affect large numbers of people.